Hey everyone, I wanted to create a video for week 2 where I talk about the next step in understanding how rhetoric and argument works. I've read all your guys' discussion board questions. I love how everyone has defined rhetoric. So what we're going to do in this lecture is I'm going to kind of talk about the next step in rhetoric and argument. I love the fact that in our class, most students want to define rhetoric as, they want to use the word persuade as part of their definition of rhetoric. I'm still going to maintain my definition of rhetoric as of week 2, and I'm still going to define rhetoric as words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to challenge our class. I've never challenged either a ground class or an online class, but can you persuade me that rhetoric is, in fact, the ability to persuade and not to manipulate, deceive, and con people. But let me talk about in this lecture, there are 3 things that rhetoric and argument always use. So rhetoric and argument always use 3 things. Rhetoric and argument uses logos, pathos, and ethos. So I want to talk about these 3 things. And so in a ground class, I'll write these 3 terms on the board, and I'll basically ask students to find what do they think these terms mean, just by either looking at the word or hearing the word. So if we look at the first thing that rhetoric and argument use are logos. And notice most students can either look at the word logos or hear the word logos, and they can immediately associate logos with logic. So logos is in fact logic. And if we want to accept your definition, our class's definition, as the ability to persuade, well, it would make sense that you'd want to use logic. It makes sense that you'd want to use facts, right? So facts could fall under logic. So logos is an appeal to logic. Now the second thing that rhetoric and argument always use is pathos. Pathos is an appeal to emotion. And so if you accept my definition of rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people, it would make sense that you'd want to use pathos or emotion to appeal to people, because we're all, in the end, emotional beings. So pathos is emotion. I always try to associate the P with something like passion, so that students can remember, oh, the P stands for emotion. The last thing that rhetoric and argument use is ethos. And ethos can be defined two ways. It can be defined as character and authority, or it can be defined as ethics. I will not define ethos as ethics in our class, because I'm planning, hopefully, at the end of class to look at a specific argument that we use called stasis theory, which deals with more on ethics. So ethos is generally defined as character or authority. And that's the one that most students tend to have a little bit of problems with, because they're not sure what they mean by character or authority. But the example that I always use is, in a ground class, is I might use, who would you rather have our class taught with, a professor from Harvard or me? And the reason why I sort of ask that question is because someone who is a professor at Harvard has a really strong ethos, right? They have strong credibility because, you know, Harvard is perhaps the greatest university in the nation, so it kind of gives you a little bit of sense of how ethos might work. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the next step of how rhetoric and argument work. Rhetoric and argument use 3 things: logos, pathos, ethos. Logos is logic, ethos is ethics or character and authority, and pathos is emotion. And afterwards there's a discussion board question where I'll have you reflect on these 3 terms.